Hey guys, so this is kind of random, but I wanted to read this book. It kind of means a lot to me. I read it a lot when I was a kid. Well, not when I was a kid, I was probably a teenager reading it. Naru was being very annoying, so she's going to be making noises in the background. But I just want to read a little bit of this book, just because why not? So, oh hello, Naru came to join us, did you? So it's called Hand Me Down. It's by Leigh Bonheur, who was, I believe, born in Wellington in New Zealand. It's an autobiography. Yeah, of her childhood. It's really dark. It has dark themes, so if that offends you, then you probably shouldn't listen to this. But anyway, so Chapter 1: The Severance. My mother knelt on the mat at the side of my bed, pulling a pair of new cotton socks on my feet and occupying herself with making sure they were straight so that the lace pattern wasn't twisted. "This afternoon you'll have a new mummy," she said. I thought, a new mummy? This must be a joke. But I wasn't sure. Sometimes when she was joking, I took her seriously, and when she was most serious, I thought she meant to be funny. I stared at my feet. Then, still unsure, I looked at her as she knelt, staring up at me. "What do you mean, a new mummy?" "A lady will be coming to take you home with her this afternoon, and she'll be your new mummy." Further silence while I considered this, until suddenly I realized, with a thrill of pleasure, that I really was to have a new mother. The memory of the faces of all the women I had known ran through my mind. Perhaps one of them would be my mother. I struggled to keep my face blank and not show the excitement that surged through me. Who knows? I might get a good mummy this time. Suddenly, a new and terrible thought, like a comet with a tail. Does that mean a new daddy too? My lips trembled, my voice shook. "Of course, you don't think he'll be going with you, do you?" She laughed. "There'll be a new daddy where you're going." I considered the thought of parting with my father. I heard his voice in my mind, saw him as vividly as if he were in the room, and knew I could never give him up. By now my mother had lifted me from the bed and was calmly laying out the rest of my clothes. "Come on," she said, "move yourself and get dressed. You needn't go to Sunday school. They'll be here for you right after lunch." They'll be here, I thought, and then I'll be gone, and I'll never see my daddy again. Actually, you're very lucky. They're willing to adopt you even though you're 7. They don't have any children, and they have plenty of money. You'll do all right for yourself, you will. That's if you behave yourself, of course. This last with a prod of her finger. Only the last words had any meaning for me. Perhaps it's just as well if I have a new daddy. My daddy thinks I'm a bad girl, and I never will be able to prove to him that I'm really a good girl. This new daddy won't know about me, and he'll truly love me. Feeling a little better, I finished dressing and went down the long hall to the kitchen and joined the family at breakfast. I gazed around the shining room, making my farewells to the pictures on the walls, especially the calendar from our butcher, showing a lovely furry kitten with enormous golden eyes, and the little ornaments on the dresser, a china shepherdess, brass candlesticks. On the mantel over the fireplace, the clock chimed the half hour. Next to the clock was my money box, and I wondered if she would give this to me when I left. Not likely, though. She was a stickler for honesty in me, yet many times I had come upon her with a knife in the slot of my money box, its contents spilled into her hand. No apology or explanation was ever given, though I had once dared to ask why it was stealing if I took other people's money, but right for her to take mine. I was thrashed for my impudence. Now I looked one by one at the members of my family. My mother, busy making the toast, appeared just the same as on any other day, her hair neatly combed and drawn back into a roll at the nape of her neck. Her eyes met mine without a flicker, but I noted the pursed lips and withdrew my gaze. To one side of her, Murray played happily in his pram. He had been fed and washed earlier. Smelling sweetly of baby powder, he sat dividing his attention between his toy rabbit and the activity at the table. I thought how dear he was to me, and how at 7 months he was already such a knowing and loving little creature. In a rush of self-pity, I thought, he'll never know he had a sister. Inch by inch, my eyes travelled to my father's plate. His eyes were busily buttering a piece of toast. I studied the signet ring on his finger until the hand with the ring raised the toast to his mouth. The other hand was lying on the tablecloth beside his plate. My eyes moved up his arm to his shoulder and down his shirt. A new one. And he had on a tie. Fancy a tie at breakfast on Sunday morning. Up over the tie to his face. Shaven, too. I gave him a long look. What I was searching for, I didn't know. Perhaps if he were to really look at me, and I mean look, He would know he loved me and refuse to let me go, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. They slipped and slithered everywhere, never looking in any one direction. Try as I would, I couldn't guess which way they would flicker next. I sat and looked at him, drinking in every part of a face so well loved, I would remember it, always, like a photograph in my mind. After breakfast, I was sent outside with a book, and in the house a fever of activity began. I heard my mother rushing around, sweeping, polishing, dusting in a frenzy, which in itself was strange because our house was spotless already. If this was for the benefit of my new mother and father, they must be very important, I thought. I pinched myself hard on 2 occasions to convince myself it was not a dream. Twice my father came out of the house, once on his way to his tool shed, and again to put some rubbish in the bin. He didn't look in my direction, and my call of Daddy met with no response from him. My mother, who was shaking dust from a mop some distance away from me, called out, "Now then, Doris, don't bother your father." I was left to wonder how she could hear me, while he couldn't. Lunch passed as if I were in a trance. I spooned down the food on my plate, chewing without tasting. There were sharp words between my mother and my father, but I couldn't understand what it was all about. It was as if the me I knew wasn't really there. The dishes done, I was sent to wash myself and return in my petticoat to the dining room, where my mother was waiting. Over the backside of a chair were a new blue organdy dress and matching petticoat with frills. She helped me into them and began brushing my long hair, which she tied with a blue ribbon. Finally, my almost new white buckskin shoes, and I was ready. She stood back with satisfaction, calling out, "Come and have a look at her, Jack. Do you think she'll do?" For the first time, my father looked at me directly. "My, you do look pretty. Too good to part with." No doubt he meant well, but the effect on me was terrible. My bones turned to rubber and my head flushed hot as the blood roared in my ears. I sank, cross-legged on the mat at his feet, locking my arms around his knees, scalding tears rolling down and dripping on my dress. I love you, don't send me away," I heard, as though the sound came from outside myself, my own voice rising to a choking scream. Somehow we were separated, and he left the room. I never saw him again. Not unkindly, my mother raised me to my feet, wiped my eyes and blotted the tear spots from my dress. "Sit down," she said, pushing me towards the sofa. "For goodness sake, let's not have any more crybaby carryings on." She disappeared for a moment and came back carrying Murray, who smiled and gooed, reaching out his arms to me. Plopping him in a big armchair, she said, "Play with him for a while, and don't make that awful noise again or you'll frighten the life out of him." Moments later, I heard steps coming up our front path and onto the veranda. A murmured conversation was followed by the ringing of the doorbell and my mother's quick steps along the hall. I heard the door open. Drifts of conversation floated back between her and 2 others. One was a man's voice, which sounded deep and pleasant. All 3 came along the hall, then their voices faded, so I knew my mother had taken them into the front room. I sat like a statue. What do you say when you meet a new mother and father for the first time and you were 7? What should I call them? I hadn't time to reach a decision before I heard my mother coming for me. "Come on, they're waiting for you," she said, marching me in front of her along the hall towards the front room. I pulled back, unwilling to enter, afraid of what lay ahead. A push in the small of my back ended my hesitation and I was over the threshold. In that second, my new mother and father were no longer figures of my imagining, but 2 solid creatures, real people. Side by side they sat in stiff, high-backed chairs, and when I appeared they stood and we stared at one another. Somewhere over my head I heard my mother say, "Doris, meet Mr. and Mrs. Manton. They are to be your father and mother now." They stood there regarding me solemnly, and they looked very strange together. She was short and dark and wore a grey dress of shiny fabric. It was belted with a loose tie belt which had slipped down below her curving stomach, making her look fat and short. Her hands, with sharp fingers and backs heavily freckled, had an unpleasant bird-like look which made me think of talons. I looked into her face. 2 shoe-button brown eyes stared into mine, not the tiniest smile in them, or around her small tight mouth. A brown straw hat was wedged down over her forehead and sat just above her eyebrows, almost hiding black curly hair with white streaks. She looked at me without expression. Nothing flowed from her. Not curiosity, not like or dislike, just a steady, unwinking stare. She's like a round black spider. Horror made me drop my eyes in case she knew my thought. The man was tall and thin. He was wearing a wide-brimmed fur-felt hat, and as our eyes met, he removed it, almost as though he thought I could see him better without it. The sandy, straight, fine hair was parted in the middle and pressed down, and the mark left by his hat ran across his forehead and around his hair. He had light-coloured eyebrows and pale blue eyes. We looked keenly at each other and we smiled. He reached down and ruffled my hair. Speaking in a soft voice with a smile that started in his eyes and spread to his lips, he said, "So, you're to be our little girl." "Yes, sir, mister." There was general laughter. The Mantons began talking to my mother again, so I was able to watch them without their being aware of it. But my study of them did nothing to change my first impression. They still looked odd. In fact, as I later learned, she was more than 20 years older than he. I reached the gloomy conclusion that I was no better off with my new parents than with the old ones. I like him, but she's awful. Nothing has changed after all. The conversation between the adults showed signs of petering out, and Mr. Manton suggested leaving. Then to me he said, "Are you ready to come with us, Doris?" This seemed nice of him, since I really didn't have any choice. My mother appeared with Murray in her arms. Behind her in the hall I heard quick steps, then something heavy put down by the door, followed by hastily retreating footsteps. As we moved into the hall I saw what the heavy object was. A suitcase. Mr. Manton picked it up. As the front door opened, the late afternoon sun streamed into the porch, setting the polished brass doorstep alight in its reflection. There was an awkward pause as we reached the gate. Once more Mr. Manton eased the way by saying, "Oh well, nice to have met you." Mrs. Manton gave a nervous giggle, and I looked at my mother, wondering what she expected me to say to her. As I began to walk to the street where the Mantons were waiting, she bent down to kiss me on the cheek. "Be a good girl, Doris," she said. And then I was in the street. The gate clicked shut. I looked searchingly at the front of the house for a glimpse of my father. If he was watching, it was from out of sight. All in a dream, my feet moved, left, right, left, right. The corner came towards me. Then we were around it. Well, I thought, my daddy would expect me to be brave. There's the end of chapter 1! I don't know I don't know. I hope you liked it. I don't know if I'll read the rest, because that's slightly copyright infringement, but I don't know, I just thought I'd do this because I'm bored, and I don't know, I felt like talking, so yeah. So that's it, I guess. So let me know what you thought. I haven't read a book aloud before, so yeah, so I'll see you maybe next time, or maybe just in something else. Bye bye.